Where's the worship team? Is the worship team here? Are they in the room? Do we need to check the playground? Is that? Oh, here they come. Okay.
Well, welcome to.
Can you,
no, you go.
Go.
No, we talked about it in the back room.
Okay, I'll do it. Okay. Hey guys, welcome to chapel. You're already standing, so let's worship. Okay, well, let's worship. Okay, start it. I think we could try. Let's try it again. Sorry. Okay. 5, 6, 7, 8. Where there is new wine, there is new power. Freedom. I am a child of God. That's awkward. I'm so sorry. Our rehearsal was really short and really rough. The discipleship team, I am so sorry. We'll get it together, I promise. But not right now. I don't think this is the time, so we're just gonna go. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Man, oh man, oh man, oh man, oh man. We did it this time. So it's hard to worship when there's an elephant in the room. It's hard to do anything when there's an elephant in the room. I've heard some people have already named this elephant already. It's only been 2 days. I'm not gonna say the name, but so it's just hard to do anything when there's an elephant in the room because you have to address it. You can't just get past it. We couldn't worship. We couldn't even sit down. Look, this is gonna be a nice, comfortable living room, y'all, and we couldn't do it because there's an elephant in the room. And so we are going to tackle this elephant, not literally, because I don't want any videotape of me tackling an elephant that has the word sex on it, but we are going to tackle this elephant. So you guys can have a seat right now as we deal with the elephant in the room. So the last series, which was asking for a friend, you guys sent in all of your questions and we dove into your questions, but we didn't dive into the questions that came on the topic that you asked about the most. And the topic you asked about the most, whether you're watching online, welcome, or you're here, was the topic of sex and sexuality. Ready? So out of about 700 questions almost 200 questions came on sex and sexuality. And they ranged from questions on sex to pornography, to questions about homosexuality, to questions on gender issues. And I can tell you for the next 3 weeks, we're going to dive into it all. One sex chapel, I heard someone say, and actually read some of these quotes from you guys. One sex chapel is not going to do it. Matter of fact, because of one sex chapel is not going to do it, this is the Sexuality Chapel series. But I wanna read this, because here's some things that you guys said. So I was asking people on Tuesday morning, do you know anything about what's happening this week in chapel? So here's what someone said, ready? I know what they're gonna say already, Mr. Mayo. You don't even have to tell me, I know, I don't even have to go. I said, oh really? So what are you gonna say? Hey, sex is dangerous. I was like, okay, never heard that one before. Don't even think about it until you get married. So let me say we're not going to say that. God made us all sexual beings. Sex is an amazing gift from God. Take it from someone who knows, I'm married. And we need to break that down though, in a way that hopefully if you missed part of it or you haven't had this conversation in places where you should have, you can have it. Someone said this, oh, I heard about this. It's just gonna be the sex chapel, so I don't really have to go because I know what they're gonna say. Well, again, this is not one chapel. This is a whole sexuality series. Someone else said this, you're gonna tell us we don't know anything when it comes to this area. We just need to wait until we get older. And I definitely don't believe that. And I know hopefully you don't believe it because a lot of you know a lot about this topic and all the topics that I mentioned already. And you know a lot about it and you're finding out information about it already. And the elephant is in the room, but check this out. So you're looking at this elephant I heard this is going around on social media, so I haven't checked it out, but maybe I'll look at some of the videos you guys are sending to each other or have been sent to you. But to me, the elephant in the room is not sex. That's not the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the fact that we don't have conversations about this, about sex and sexuality as much as we should in the places where you should hear it. Now, you could be like, all right, Mr. Mayo, so the places where I should hear it, so tell me the places where I should hear it, okay? If the elephant in the room is not just sex, it's the fact that we don't talk about this enough in the way you should hear it, I'll give you the first one. So you should hear about it, and hopefully this is not the first time, from your parents. So parents, if you're watching online, now's the time, dive in, you need to have those conversations. And now, you might be like, oh, Mr. Mayo, hold up. My parents talked to me a long time ago, maybe a couple years ago, about the birds and the bees, but talking to them now about sex is a little awkward. Okay, I don't want to talk to my mom and dad right now about that. Okay, but you should be talking to them about it. That's a source. That's your first source. Your parents are your most important spiritual leaders. They will be mandated by God, okay? Second, you should be having this conversation more in the church. Now, I'm not saying the church is not having this conversation, but I think we should have it even more than we do. And you might say, well, my church is doing a great job. We talk about this a lot, and that's good, but not all churches are there. And even though we do, we should talk about it more than we do. The church should be the place you hear it because you're gonna hear it right next to truth. And lastly, I would say, if you're in this room, you have the privilege of being in a Christian school, which is amazing. Some people aren't even in school, but you're in school in a Christian school. And that means we have a duty to dive into this topic today. And so that's what we're gonna do. And we're gonna do it in a way that I hope for you guys is refreshing. And I'll say this. So again, like I said, you've heard messages about it. Let me give you some places where, because those are places you should hear, but real quick, here's some places you have no problem finding information about sex, okay? And you guys know this. So first, TV, okay? Or Netflix, no problem. Just turn on the TV, turn on Netflix. I'll guarantee you don't have to be on those mediums long before all of a sudden there's tons of information, messaging coming at you about sex, okay? The internet. More specifically, places like YouTube or places like, Instagram or Twitter or TikTok or wherever. Messages about sex and sexuality are coming at you. You can 24/7. Some of you, I was gonna say you could wake up, you go to sleep and wake up at this time tonight, but some of you are awake till this hour. You could wake up at 4 a.m. and go on YouTube and go on TikTok, or you could go on Twitter, and I guarantee you it will not be long before you find messaging about sexuality. So there's no problem getting those bombardments, I call them, or those narratives. And I wanna break down this word real quick, and then we're gonna invite a lot of people to come sit down. There's no problem getting those bombardments or those narratives, and this is what a narrative is. A narrative is like a view, or here's a way to think about this, okay? Or it's kind of an introduction to a framework. You have no problem getting those narratives anytime you want, but the question is, are those narratives placed next to truth? So you guys have said, hey, please dive into the real issues. We're about to dive into the real issues in a way that I hope is really helpful, and I wanna say one more thing before we all sit down, and that's this. Like, when my generation was coming up, anytime someone talked about Jesus, they didn't really have sex involved. And a lot of times when I got the sex talk, okay, and we'll break this down a little bit more, it didn't have anything to do with Jesus. They never put those two things together, and that's the way you should hear it. Now, that was just me, that's my story. Some places, it was done a little bit better, but when I heard that, so almost naturally, I started to compartmentalize those two things, and they shouldn't be compartmentalized. When you talk about sex, you better talk about Jesus, okay? And Jesus made us sexual beings. That's part of who you are. Discipleship, true discipleship, you guys see on the walls all the time, make disciples. Make disciples. We can't make disciples without talking about sex. Why would we leave that out? And that's a huge part of the way God created you. So this is not gonna be your normal I always say, this is not your grandmother's sex talk, okay? The way you used to hear it. Now, I don't know your grandma. Maybe she gives like a great sex talk and she's great at explaining. I don't know. But what I'm saying is this is gonna be in a different way that you're used to hearing it, and I hope you're ready. So I know Mrs. Quinn is about to talk to you a little bit, and then we're gonna invite some people up, but this is kind of the intro. Get ready.
So what we did, and what we really want to do, is to begin to incorporate discipleship and sexuality. And I think it's so much like what Mr. Mayo said.
Alike.
Mr. Most is coming up. Yeah, they look a lot alike. But one of the things that we have realized is that the world does such a great job of getting their message across. And it's all the time, everywhere, What's your saying, Mr. Mayo?
Everybody, everywhere,
Everybody,
all the time.
everybody.
That should be discipleship, but yeah, that's what they do.
That should be discipleship, but that is exactly how the world messages sex. And so we kind of know the do's and don'ts about sex from a Christian perspective, but we don't really spend a deep kind of like moment in it, and we don't incorporate it into our spirituality. And that is our goal. Our goal is to change the conversation here as Christians, walking and doing life together and really beginning to put these two things, our spirituality and our sexuality, together, because that is how they have been made. Now, what we want to do is so their question is, and this is really important, you're being discipled, but who's really discipling you? And you guys love Jesus. I'm convinced of that. Most of the people in this room, I know a lot of you, I love talking to the juniors and seniors. The freshmen and the sophomores were a little rough. They didn't know what narrative was. We had to like explain things to them. But I love talking to you guys because I know you and you love Jesus. But around this area, we are being discipled by whom? Is it really by our Christian ethic, or is it by the world's ethic? So you should have gotten a sheet when you came in. We're gonna take a little quiz. We're gonna kind of make it. So I want you to take a look at this sheet. We're gonna give you a couple minutes, and while we give you a couple minutes to do this, on one side, it says, discuss how you would respond to the following questions from the current cultural perspective and from a Christian perspective. So you're gonna answer these questions two ways. Now we're gonna give you a couple minutes while Mr. Mose and Ms. Fox come up here and we kind of get settled up here because we want to have a conversation, and that's what we wanna do. We want to have these conversations as people of faith. So we're gonna ask you guys to start this by having a conversation with a person who's like 6 feet apart from you. I don't know, you can yell it at them or something. And I want you to try to answer it these ways and see which way is easier to answer. So take just a few minutes, read through those questions, and we'll call you back up. So this is good. I'm already seeing good conversations out there. Everybody's engaged, nobody's asleep yet. This is good. Okay, so let me just kind of bring it back a little bit and see what you think about this. How many of you found it really easy to answer this, and with a why, from the world's perspective? Like if the world were to answer this question, how easy was it for you to answer that? Like, yeah, I know what the world says about this. I know exactly what they would say, and I know why they would say it. How many of you could come up with the answer from the Christian perspective, but when you had to answer why, didn't get much further than, well, the Bible says so? Yeah. And that is not a deep understanding or a satisfying theology. And it's not something that will ever be missional to the world. And you have to know that there is so much pain and so much confusion around sexuality in our world right now, current events, notwithstanding, that as Christians, we need to have a much deeper, more satisfying theology around our sexuality for ourselves, but also to be missional and to bear the image of Christ in a hurting world. I love this quote, and it said, "We should not be ashamed to discuss what God was not ashamed to create." And so that's sort of our motto. We're going to have open discussions. We want to change the culture in the Christian community, in our school, with our families. We want to change the culture where we actually can have robust, satisfying, deep, meaningful discussions about the purpose of our sexuality, about how our sexuality honors God and reflects His image. And we want to reclaim this area of sexuality that the world has done a really, really good job of discipling us in. Even as Christians, I'm going to tell you this. New Barna study says 11% of Gen Z and millennials, that's you guys, 11% actually use spiritual or religious guides to make decisions about their sexuality. The other 89% do not. And a lot of that 89% are Christians, but they don't have any impact on their sexual decisions from their spirituality. I think a lot of us love Jesus, but if you were to look at our social media, if you were to look at what we watch, if we were to look at what we think, maybe even what we do, a lot of us are sort of like sexual atheists. And my story was silence. I didn't have anyone talk to me about sexuality. I had to find it all out from someone else. And there was just a lot of confusion around that. So what we've done is we've decided we're gonna have a conversation up here. And so we've invited some of our really good friends and really cool people. Give it up for really cool people up here. And we're gonna talk about some of these narratives that are informing you and probably shaping what I'm gonna call your sexual ethic. And I don't know if you know it or not, but by now, as juniors and seniors, you have a sexual ethic. You have something that drives your decisions about your sexuality, what you think, what you do. And we need to talk about what those things actually are, and then we need to reclaim it and reshape it. So.
And real quick, because I'm going to dive in with Mr. Most with a question for him, but I'll just say that this is a safe space. You already asked the questions anyway and sent them in. So as we go through these 3 weeks, continue to ask questions. This is, it's not like, hey, we're dictating and just talking to you. We want to have a conversation with you. There's a conversation up here, but we want a conversation to be happening with you in your small groups. For more questions to come, that's what we want. So, Mr. Most, I'm going to ask you this. You're kind of the theology guy. And so as you look at what Mrs. Quinn just talked about and the bombardment, which I call, but the narrative, the ethic that the world is sending all the time, if we're getting that all the time, break that down. What is that?
Yeah, so I think first I'd just want to go back and look at this word culture. So I'm certainly guilty of this, and a lot of your teachers are too. We sort of sometimes just throw this word out. Oh, well, the culture is this, or the world, those two things are synonymous, says this. And I want to just back up real quick and just say, okay, so when we say culture, what do we mean? What do we mean? Words don't just exist they don't just like pop up out of nowhere, right? They have historical root and sort of like a etymological lineage. They've got a sort of, so for example, there's a Greek word bios, it means life. There's a Greek word logos, it means like word or study of. We have an English word, biology, which means the study of life that is derivative of those two words. You tracking with me? So all of our words are like that in some sense. It's no different with the word culture. So there's 3 Latin words that sort of serve as the foundation to this word culture that we use in the English language. The first one is colere, the second one is colonus, and the third one is cultus. Colere is a word that indicates something like agriculture. So it's something like cultivate. So think of like a farmer cultivating the crops in order to get the best yield for that specific season. That's what colere kind of indicates. Colonists, you might hear some root word in there. It's where we get our word colony. Okay, so colonists is indicating like a group of people, right? A specific group of people. And then finally, this one might be the most important, is the Latin word cultus. That's where we get our English word cult. And that word specifically just outright means worship. Okay, so when we hold those three words together, we get a group of people that are being formed or cultivated, or the soil is being tilled to produce some kind of worship. Remember, you guys haven't taken my culture class because I just started it this year, but we always say that worship isn't just something we do in the sanctuary, right? Worship is something we do all the time. Worship is anything that we direct an extreme amount of time, money, energy, attention, care, thought, etc. to. So if we define worship that way, we do it all the time. So that's kind of the overall idea of culture. If that's the sort of etymological family, as I said, we have to look at the modern story of culture then, okay? So what's going on now, and can we connect it to anything we've seen before? And in fact, we can. The modern story of culture is actually somewhat of an old story. And I want to go back around 100 years, between 1900, 1920, there are unbelievable technological strides. So we see planes, right? Two brothers in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, take flight for the first time. We see the steam engine, we see the telegraph, we see the Ford Model T. It's the Industrial Revolution, right? There's some historians in the room that can fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. And alongside with the Industrial Revolution, and hang with me here because I'm going to try and string together a few thoughts, is an uninhibited new belief in the power of man. Okay, and you can see how that would make sense, right? All of a sudden, all these inventions are coming out that arise out of our own ingenuity and our own ability. And so as the belief in humanity and its goodness and its power and its ability rises, trust in God then naturally fell. And so all of that happens up until, essentially 19, 16, 17, 18, when a great tragedy occurred that involved using the very technological strides to inflict great harm on people. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? World War I, right? So all of a sudden now we see for the first time tanks. We see chemical warfare. We see submarine warfare, the likes of which we've never seen before. The Germans were crazy. All of these things are using the very inventions that were formerly used to believe in the power of man are now very much proving how depraved man is. Now, that's the old story, but the modern story isn't all that different. Okay, so now from 2010 to 2020, we've got unbelievable technological strides, just like 100 years ago, but instead of industrial they're digital. So we are going through what is called now the digital revolution as opposed to the industrial revolution. We can do unthinkable things with our phones, right? Like I can tap two buttons and little servants that are out there driving around in cars will just appear out of nowhere and pick me up and take me somewhere or deliver my favorite fast food. Like that's unreal. Like you guys are all used to this, but I was born in the 90s. I didn't always have that. That's crazy to me, but it's normal for us. And so again, just like 100 years ago, we are seeing this uninhibited assertion of the individual, of humankind, and how able we are and how good we are. But instead of maybe the industrial side effects or the war side effects that kind of demonstrate this downturn, instead of external, I think some of the tragedy we're seeing is more internal in terms of how we just can direct our own sexuality and say anything and do anything because that's the highest order of good.
Well, I think that's my question. Okay, so we told you it wasn't going to be the typical subject. Who knew you were going to learn all that? But it's so important to understand the framework that we're working in. And so I guess my question is at this point is, that's our cultural framework, but how does that sort of get expressed in our own individual kind of sexuality, or how are we seeing this played out in individuals?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different narratives, and we can talk about, different trends and streams and things that are happening. But I think one big one that I see is the cultural belief that's kind of king right now is that the most important thing is my freedom to be able to do whatever I want. Okay, that's kind of king. That's the most important thing. That's one of the biggest cultural stories we're told. And if you in some way tell me I can't do it or tell me it's wrong, then you're canceled, right? That's one of the biggest things that we're seeing in 2021 now. And we have to ask ourselves, is it true? Is that idea of I can determine my own freedom any way I want and I can define the world in any terms that I want to define the world, is it true? No, because ultimately there are hardwired limitations that I just cannot get past. So for example, if I have freedom, I should be free to be an NFL linebacker right now. Most of you should be laughing at me because that's just not the case. Like I'm out of my prime and kind of, a little pudgy, and I'd run like a 5.7 40 and no one would sign me and everyone would laugh at me, even if I got invited to an NFL combine. Why? Because there's hardwired realities that limit naturally my freedom. No matter how hard I try, that's not gonna happen. Also, there's this idea, so that's an external dynamic. An internal dynamic is that my own ideas of freedom conflict. Okay, so in the last year, because of a pandemic and a son that I had, Papa's gained a little weight, okay? So I got on the scale like 2 months ago and I was like, oh, I'm 15 pounds heavier than I've ever been. Now, I have competing freedoms. I have one desire that says, I wanna live a long and healthy life and avoid back pain and play as many sports as I can with my kid and be healthy as long as I can. That's one freedom that I want to assert. But another freedom is I wanna eat all the bacon double cheeseburgers that I can because they're delicious. And so when I sit down at a restaurant and I look at a menu, my freedoms are competing as I think, should I order a salad and commit to the long-term health freedom, or should I order that double bacon cheeseburger with fries and commit to that, eat the most delicious things on the menu freedom? So even within myself, these freedoms conflict. And maybe just one more thought with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis said, true freedom isn't the absence of all rules, it's the presence of the right rules. Let's say it again. True freedom isn't the absence of all rules. That's what our culture thinks that true freedom is. It's not the absence of all rules, it's the presence of the right rules. And he gives the example of a fish, right? True freedom for a fish dictates that that fish should be able to be free to live in the water or on the land. But reality dictates that it's a different story for that fish. If you've ever seen a fish on a dock or on a boat, it is a stupid creature. It is flopping around and it's completely incapacitated and it's, ridiculous. But as soon as you put that fish in the water, it's beautiful and fast and agile because it's operating according to the right rules that it was created to operate in.
I think that's so powerful to understand this idea that the culture has about freedom, and that we have actually taken in messages which put us at conflict with each other. And as people of faith, I think we have to struggle with that within our spiritual understandings. And most of those spiritual understandings, for those of us, come from our family, come from our experience in church. And our families are good, and our churches are places that disciple us and encourage us in our walk with Christ. But I think the messaging in recent years in sort of the traditional church around sexuality has been difficult in church, or maybe even non-existent. And I have gotten to know Ms. Tara Fox well since she's come with us, and I love her. And she was raised, like many of you, in a Christian family, in a church. And just, Tara, how did you kind of embrace those messages, or what were some of the messages that you received from your family and in church around sexuality?
Hey guys. Two things stick out. I would say the first message was one of silence, which you alluded to earlier. And that's simply where sex and sexuality were not talked about. And, Mr. Mayo, I mixed you guys up again.
You look so much alike, you guys.
You'd alluded to this earlier as well. You know, when the church is not talking about this, the messages come from somewhere else. And my experience growing up is that the messages I was getting were largely not rooted in truth. And it also illustrated this thought that God was not involved in matters of sex and sexuality, like he wasn't interested, and really he had nothing to say about it. So silence, I would say, is one. But I think the larger message that I was affected by in my own story growing up is something that we now call the purity culture. And the purity culture was a lot of rules and a list of do's and don'ts. But the largest one, the main rule was don't have sex until you get married. And if you were a virgin when you got married, you were pure. And if you were not, you weren't. And there, you know, there's some variations to that. I'm half Trinidadian, and in some Caribbean cultures, and I'm sure in other places too, there was a sense that, you know, girls should be virgins, but boys needed to be a man and go out and sow their wild oats. So, you know, there's some variance there. But the ultimate message was, if you're a virgin, you will get married, the sex will be awesome, and you will live happily ever after.
And so, you know, you hear that, and it's really unfortunate. I don't know. I want you guys to think about, you know, your churches right now, because a lot of people would say, well, you know, man, you might identify with that and say, hey, I kind of heard that, or maybe some of the adult leaders, the teachers in the room might say, hey, you know what? That was kind of the message I got. But then others would say, well, you know, my church, you know, they actually did a pretty good job. But, you know, when you listen to that experience, I'm so glad you shared that, because some people can identify with that experience of their church. And that's definitely not obviously the way it should go. And again, like we talked about, we want to make sure that the church is the place God's designed for us to hear this well. So as I'm listening to you kind of share that, Tara, and what the message you were getting for your experience, what did that do for you personally? Like, how did that affect you?
Three things come to mind. The largest one, the one I was probably most deeply impacted by, was shame. Because the message we received was, if you were no longer a virgin, then you had ruined your life, you were worthless, and no good, decent Christian person would want to marry you. I saw twice, once in high school and once in college, I saw a pastor take the first, one time was a construction paper heart, and the second time was a red rose. I saw a pastor pass it out among like 100 teenagers or something, and we were instructed to rip at it and crumple it and tear it and just sort of manhandle it. And it was passed to the back and then brought up to the front again, and the pastor would hold this paper heart or this rose, and it was broken and torn and dirty. And I heard the pastor say basically the same thing each time, something to the effect of, this broken thing. If you've engaged in any sexual activity, this is you. Who would want that? It was a devastating thing to hear as a young person in that audience. And it really created an us versus them mentality. Like, there were the virgins, the non-virgins, the pure and the not pure, so to speak. And so there was also a lot of shame for sexual sin held in secret, because things weren't talked about and because questions weren't asked. There weren't places where you felt like you could share your struggles. There was this fear of rejection and condemnation. And I wondered if people knew like what I'd done or my struggles or things like that, would they only identify me as X, Y, and Z? Is that all they would see me as? And I think the deeper, more painful question in that is if people really knew, would they still love me? And for many, many years, I mean, decades, I didn't have the courage to find out. And then I would say the third aspect of shame, specifically as a woman, there was a lot of body shaming. We were told that it was our responsibility if a man lusted. And I could be completely covered up in a t-shirt and shorts that were appropriate length. But yet somehow it was my fault if I led him into temptation, into lust. And so there was a lot of body shaming with that as well. So shame was a big part of that. Confusion was a really big part of that as well. purity is good, right? Like purity of heart and mind and action, but it was equated on a level almost with salvation. Like purity and virginity were equal to salvation. And so because the only line in the sand was sexual intercourse, don't cross this line, it kind of became the age-old question, well, how far is too far? And so you try to get as close to the line as possible. And it's a very me-centered approach to sexuality because it's all about what can I take from that person for my own personal satisfaction. And because like biblical sexuality was never talked about, there was also this undercurrent that sex was dirty. Expectations of sex within a marriage was never talked about. Like, what does that look like? And so that kind of confusion led to more than one friend of mine in tears on her wedding night. Another confusion, I would say, was even the purpose of the family. And, you know, what is the purpose of marriage? Because virginity was the goal to get married, like being a virgin when you got married, it made marriage the goal. And so ultimately it became the pursuit of marriage and not the pursuit of holiness that was the goal of the Christian life. And so there was shame, there was confusion, and then all of that led to incomplete messaging. And if you're told just like be a virgin when you get married, well, what happens when you don't get married? What happens if you identify as gay, if you've been the victim of sexual abuse? What happens when you get married and you find out it's hard? A spouse has been unfaithful, divorce happens, you lose your spouse, you find out you can't have kids, you lose a child, God forbid, and on and on and on. And I don't want you guys to misunderstand me. You know, I love the church, and I've been the beneficiary of faithful teaching of men and women in church, and I'm so thankful for the fellowship of believers. Like, we get to be brothers and sisters, like, in Christ. But in my personal experience with this topic, the church made promises that it could not keep. And it left me wondering for a long time, is God a liar? Is he even good?
Wow. Thank you for being so vulnerable and for sharing and for including us in your journey with that. Both of my daughters were raised here at CCA and had similar experiences with the messaging around sexuality. And they have had some struggles that are very similar to yours, and I hope someday they get to meet you and talk to you. But what we want to do is, where the church does so many other things so well, we want us as a faith community to do this well. And we want to not engage in silence or shame or judgment. We want to begin to bring the conversation into a place where we can literally walk together and wrestle with ideas and go into a deep biblical understanding of this. One of the things that I love that you said about the purity narrative and some of the messages that we get in church is it's very incomplete. Because if the goal is marriage and sex is for marriage, then why did God make us sexual beings? And all of us, not everybody's going to get married, but every single one of us, and all of you guys right now, are single. How does our sexuality inform us as single people? Well, I'm married, but as single people, because that is very much who we are. And so what's the purpose of it? And how are we having really good conversations about this that help our understanding of God? How are we bringing God and our sexuality together? Because again, he's the one who made it and created the purpose for it.
And so I guess that's my next question for you, Mrs. Quinn. And can we just give Ms. Fox a hand for sharing? I thought just sharing her personal experience, like Mrs. Quinn said, was very vulnerable and open. I hope you guys can take something from that. And again, just like she shared, you know, in her experience, that's what happened. And you know, we definitely don't want incomplete messages when, no matter if it's a Christian school or your parents or, you know, where you go to church, we're still dealing with people, and people are imperfect. We're still sinners. And so it's not always going to be done the best way, but we still, again, want to value all the ways that God has for us to learn from our parents, from the church, from a Christian school is great. And so how can we have a more complete message What does that look like, Mrs. Quinn? And talk a little bit about holy sexuality.
So we would say like the third narrative that we're going to kind of highlight here and that we're going to help like kind of construct the way we view sexuality or the way we discuss sexuality, we're calling holy sexuality, just to kind of distinguish it from something. And that is a deep understanding of our sexuality theologically. And for a lot of you seniors, you're discussing this with Pastor Legier, in Marriage and Family. But for many people, this idea that our sexuality is not only just good, we hear that, oh, God made it and it's good, but that it is so much deeper than that, really hasn't fully been embraced or understood, and we want to go there. So I'm going to read through just some ways. Have you thought about sexuality in this context? And you need to know that sex is good, and it has meaning, and it has purpose, and that meaning and that purpose is designed by God. We're going to go there next chapel, so you're definitely going to want to come next chapel. We're going to go take a deep theological dive into sexuality. But I want you to hear a few things. Holy sexuality says that God created it and it was very good. But it's not just about sex. And I think so many times it's just like it's the act of sex. It's about our sexuality. And I think you have to understand that our sexuality is part of our imago Dei. It is part of how we reflect God. And we talk about all kinds of things. We had our Imago Dei series earlier in the year. But our sexuality and who we are as sexual beings also reflects God. And in some of the ways that it reflects God, it is part of how we fit together. Believe it or not, our sexualness drives us into relationship, and God created it that way because God is about relationships. God exists as a related Trinitarian being, all three of them, God the Father and the Holy Spirit, and he wants us to be drawn into relationship, and a primary way we are drawn into relationship is through our sexuality and this awakening of this desire for each other. That's another way it reflects God. God has a deep and passionate desire for us and for his people. And he has created that in us so that we experience deep and passionate desire that pulls us into relationship and binds us together. Another way that it is supposed to reflect God is that it is supposed to be covenantal. Because when God made us, he made us naked and unashamed. And that is very intimate. But that is supposed to be a very, very safe place. The Garden of Eden, man was with God. And you're going to hear it again. You're going to hear a lot about this. But he was naked and unashamed, and he was in a covenant-safe relationship. And that is how sexuality is also supposed to be held. It's also creative. Our sexuality is part of the creative life force that God has put in us. And obviously, our sexuality creates little people, like Mr. Augie, who is so cute. I hope you follow him. No. But it creates, okay, first of all, was that not incredible?
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, to have a human life form that is something that you have created, that reflects God and how he has made you to be creative. But it is also creative in the way that we bring joy and life into relationships. That joy and life that is part of a passionate, intimate relationship is also creative and life-giving. And so there is so much more to our sexuality. And even as single people who God has said, no, you do not have the act of sex, but even as single people, we are going to talk about what it means to be sexual as singles and how that helps us to reflect the image of God in so many different ways and how it helps us encourage relationships. He also created us in our sexuality to be sacrificial, and it reflects his incredible sacrificial love for us. And the culture says it's about me, it's about my freedom, it's about my pleasure. If I'm a pretty nice person, I'll try to make it about your pleasure too, but it's really about me. And God says, no, anything that is this deep, this passionate, that has this much love attached to it is sacrificial. And Christ came and died for us, and that is over and over the metaphor that is used. Christ, and we are his bride, the church. And he didn't come just to marry his bride. He came to die for his bride and to be sacrificial. And so as we begin to enter into conversation and community around this idea of what is the purpose and the meaning of our sexuality, we hope to be able to have not just a list of do's and don'ts, like with your quiz, like, oh, I can answer that, yeah, that's right, that's wrong. But we want to be able to understand why, and we want to have a deep and beautiful understanding so that we can share it with a hurting world, and we can understand it for ourselves, but also we can evaluate it. The next time you get that message about sexuality, whether it's your TikTok, whether it's an Instagram feed, whether it's something you're getting ready to post or something a friend has posted, can you evaluate it? Can you tell what narrative is driving that message? Is it a cultural narrative about your freedom to do whatever you want? Is it a shame-based narrative that maybe you've picked up from family or a list of do's and don'ts? Or is it a holy, beautiful message about sexuality? And so we actually have homework for you. And so I'm gonna have you, everybody grab your sheet again. This is chapel homework. Have you ever gotten homework in chapel before? On the back of this, we actually printed a short synopsis because when you get a hold of new information, you have to kind of see it over and over again. Read through these. And this week, I want you, every time you run into a sexual message, to try to evaluate what narrative is it coming from. And it would be really interesting to me, especially you all as our upperclassmen and people who have a lot more freedoms, it would be really interesting to me to see how many of the messages you get fall into each of those categories. How many are holy? How many come from sort of a shame-based judgment type, purity culture type of message? How many of them are from the world? Because I promise you, the messaging that you are taking in the most is the messaging that's discipling you, and it's the messaging that is crafting your sexual ethic. And that's the other thing I want to challenge you with. As we go through this series, I want you to begin to think about, what is my sexual ethic? Because God has given us wonderful minds, community to grow in, and that is something that we need to begin to do, and you need to take ownership of that.
Actually, guys, I know I want to say this real quick, and then we're actually going to close. I know we're really over time, so I know the worship team just came out, and they don't know this, but we're going to close in prayer, because I know you guys need to get to lunch, and some of you need to get to class. But I just want to say we're serious about this topic. We want to go there with you. There will be a lot of real questions that we dive into. We want you with us. I hope this has sparked a lot, and let's pray. Lord, I thank you for just this time. I thank you for the attentiveness. I thank you for, God, just people being willing to be open for these questions to come. Lord, help us as we dive into this topic. We want to do it well. We want to do it in a conversation way as a community. And Lord, help us to do it with a lot of wisdom and a lot of care. And we pray these things in your name. Amen.